In 1901, in a remote stretch of Siberian permafrost, a hunter found something that should not exist. A mammoth, whole, preserved, standing upright in the frozen ground as if it had simply stopped walking one afternoon and been buried where it stood. When scientists from St. Petersburg cut the animal open, they found something stranger still. In its stomach, undigested, fresh, still green, buttercups, grasses, wildflowers that should not have been growing within 1,000 miles of where the mammoth died. The animal had been eating in a temperate meadow, and then, in the time it took to chew, it had been flash frozen. There are dozens of these mammoths now, dozens of them across Siberia, across Alaska, across the Yukon, preserved mid-bite, mid-step, mid-life, by something that came down on them faster than any natural cooling event in the geologic record should allow. Mainstream science has names for this: anomaly, outlier, catastrophic regional cooling event. But there is a date attached to most of these animals, a date that keeps appearing across continents, across species, across evidence of every kind. 12,800 years ago. This is the story of what happened then, and of the civilization that may have been lost in the same instant. To understand what was lost, you have to understand what existed. 13,000 years ago, the world was already changing. The last great ice age, the Pleistocene, was ending. Glaciers a mile thick that had covered most of North America, most of Northern Europe, and the high latitudes of Asia were beginning to retreat. Temperatures had been climbing for 2,000 years. The mammoths were thriving. So were the giant ground sloths, the dire wolves, the saber-toothed cats. So were the humans. In North America, the people we now call the Clovis culture had spread from coast to coast. They were big game hunters with a distinctive stone tool technology, fluted spear points that show up at over 1,500 archaeological sites. They were master craftsmen. They had organized hunts. They had ritual sites. Across the Atlantic, in what is now southeastern Turkey, something even more remarkable was shaping tape. At a place called Göbekli Tepe, hunter-gatherers, people who supposedly should not have been capable of monumental construction, had begun raising stone pillars 20 feet tall, each weighing many tons, carved with images of foxes, vultures, scorpions, and an unsettling number of headless men. Göbekli Tepe is, by mainstream dating, over 11,000 years old. That makes it older than agriculture, older than the wheel, older than writing, older than Stonehenge by 7,000 years. And no one can explain how it was built. This was the world 13,000 years ago, warming, inhabited, capable, and by every measurement we can make, on its way towards something. We will never know what. Around 10,800 BC, 12,800 years ago, the climate of the entire northern hemisphere did something it had not done in over 100,000 years. It collapsed. Not slowly, not over centuries. According to ice cores from Greenland, where every annual layer of snow is preserved like the page of a book, average temperatures dropped by as much as 10 degrees Celsius in less than a decade. In some readings, less than a single year. To put that in perspective, the climate emergency that scientists debate today is a projected rise of about 2 degrees over 100 years. What happened 12,800 years ago was a 5 times larger swing in the opposite direction, in 1/1000th of the time. The northern hemisphere did not just cool, it snapped back into a full glacial state. Glaciers that had been retreating for 2,000 years began to advance again. The Atlantic Ocean's heat-carrying currents shut down. Storms intensified. Sea ice spread south to latitudes that had not seen ice since the previous ice age peaked. Geologists call this period the Younger Dryas, named for an Arctic flower whose pollen suddenly reappeared across European lake beds during the deep freeze. It lasted about 1,200 years. And then, just as suddenly, it ended. Something hit this planet hard enough to crash a warming climate into a freezer for over a millennium. The question that has divided scientists for the last 20 years is a simple one. What was it? In 2007, a team of researchers led by Richard Firestone published a paper that changed the conversation. They had been studying a thin black layer of sediment that appears at archaeological sites across North America at exactly the right depth to correspond to the start of the Younger Dryas. The layer was unusual. It was rich in carbon, the remains of widespread fire. And inside it, they found things that should not have been there. Microspherules, tiny droplets of melted glass, the kind that form only at temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Celsius, hotter than any volcano, hotter than any wildfire. Nanodiamonds, microscopic diamonds that form only under impact-level shock pressures. A spike in platinum, an element rare on Earth but common in certain types of asteroids and comets. Iridium, carbon spherules with internal voids consistent with impact debris. Magnetic spherules, glass-like carbon, melted quartz. The chemistry of the boundary layer told a story that the team summarized in one sentence. A cosmic body, most likely a fragmented comet, had broken apart in the atmosphere over North America and exploded. The airburst, or possibly a chain of airbursts, had released energy on a scale that dwarfs anything humans have ever measured. By later estimates, the energy released was somewhere between 10,000 and 100,000 megatons of TNT. For comparison, the largest nuclear weapon ever detonated was 50 megatons. The impact set the continent on fire. The fires injected so much soot into the upper atmosphere that sunlight was blocked across the northern hemisphere for years. The ice sheets, destabilized by the heat of the airbursts themselves, dumped enormous quantities of fresh water into the North Atlantic. The currents collapsed, and the climate fell off a cliff. Within a few centuries of the event, more than 35 genera of large mammals went extinct in North America alone. The mammoth, the mastodon, the giant ground sloth, the dire wolf, the American lion, larger than any lion alive today, the short-faced bear, which stood 11 feet tall on its hind legs, the American cheetah, the giant beaver, the saber-toothed cat, the North American camel, the North American horse. Gone. Not migrated, not displaced, gone. In some cases over a few generations. In some cases, judging by the carbon-dated remains, almost overnight. The Clovis people, the masters of those beautiful stone points, the hunters who had spread across 2 continents, vanished from the archaeological record at the same moment. Their tools simply stop appearing in the dirt. Whatever happened to them happened fast enough that they did not have time to evolve a new toolkit. The Clovis disappeared the way a candle goes out. In Europe, the Magdalenian culture, the people who painted the caves at Lascaux and Altamira, collapsed in the same window. In the Levant, where humans had been settling into the first permanent villages, the settlements were abandoned, and the people went back to a nomadic existence for over 1,000 years. The world did not simply get colder. The world emptied out. And then, on the other side of that 1,200-year freeze, when the climate finally stabilized again, something strange happened. Agriculture appeared. Almost everywhere. Almost simultaneously. As if the survivors had remembered how. This is where the story gets controversial. Mainstream archaeology says, the Younger Dryas ended, the climate stabilized, hunter-gatherers gradually transitioned to farming. Civilization slowly bootstrapped itself from nothing. But Göbekli Tepe is a problem. Because Göbekli Tepe, those 20-foot pillars in Turkey, was built within centuries of the Younger Dryas ending, by people who, by every other measurement, were still hunter-gatherers. People who had no agriculture, no metal, no domesticated animals, no settled life. People who had no business building a megalithic temple complex more sophisticated than anything that would appear in Europe for the next 7,000 years. How did they know how to do it? And there is more. On one of Göbekli Tepe's most prominent pillars, known as Pillar 43 or the Vulture Stone, a series of carvings have been interpreted by some researchers as a celestial calendar, a calendar pointing to a specific date, the configuration of the stars on a specific night. The date the carvings appear to reference is, within the margin of error of the astronomical computation, the start of the Younger Dryas. The hunter-gatherers of Göbekli Tepe, 1,200 years after the event, appeared to have known, appeared to have remembered. And across the world, across cultures that had no contact with one another, across languages and oceans and continents, the same story appears in oral tradition. A great flood, a cataclysm, a reset. The world as it was, destroyed. Survivors who carried knowledge into the new world. The Sumerians, the Hebrews, the Greeks, the Aztec, the Inca, the Hopi, the Aborigines. Over 300 separate flood traditions worldwide. Coincidence or memory? If you take the cosmic impact hypothesis seriously and follow it where it leads, the picture you get is this.
12,800 years ago, a fragmented comet entered Earth's atmosphere. It broke apart over the North American ice sheet and possibly other regions. The airbursts released enough energy to set continents on fire, destabilize the ice sheets, and inject so much debris into the upper atmosphere that the northern hemisphere darkened for years. The climate collapsed. Sea levels surged, first from melted ice, then from collapsing dams of glacial water that had been pent up for thousands of years. Pulses of fresh water raised global sea level by up to 4 meters in some estimates, possibly more in localized regions. Coastlines were drowned. Coastal settlements, if there were any, disappeared underwater, where even today we have barely begun to look. The megafauna died. The Clovis disappeared. The Magdalenian disappeared. A world that had been on its way towards something, toward whatever the builders of Göbekli Tepe were ultimately building toward, was knocked back into deep ice for over 1,000 years. And on the far side of that 1,000 years, agriculture appeared, monumental architecture appeared, organized religion appeared. The wheel and writing and metallurgy and astronomy began to spread across the surviving populations of the planet at a pace that mainstream chronology has always struggled to fully explain. Maybe it was independent invention everywhere at once. Or maybe, and this is the question that the evidence is increasingly forcing, there was something before. Something that ended in fire and ice and water 12,800 years ago. Something that the survivors remembered. Something they carried with them. Something we are only now beginning to find under the dirt and under the water and inside the pillars they raised to make sure we would not forget. We don't have all the answers. The cosmic impact hypothesis is still debated, still being tested, still being refined. New evidence appears every year. Some of it strengthens the hypothesis. Some of it complicates it. What is no longer in serious doubt is that something happened 12,800 years ago that was vastly larger than the slow gradualism of the textbooks. The mammoths in the ice know it. The platinum spike in the sediments knows it. The carved pillars of Göbekli Tepe seem to have known it. And the question that hangs over all of it is the question of memory. What did the survivors remember? What did they carry forward? What did they hide in stone, hoping that whoever came next would understand? What part of their world is still inside ours, waiting to be recognized? We are going to keep looking. If you want to keep looking too, subscribe.
and tell me in the comments what you think hit this planet 12,800 years ago.